Hi, everybody. We're back from the Metamodern Spirituality retreat at Sky Meadow. Bruce and Brendan and I are going to do a little bit of debrief and reminiscences. Hopefully, Brendan will walk us through a bit of what happened for people who weren't there. We can all sort of say what our experiences were. I mean, I think we've all expressed and received appreciations aplenty. So we don't have to spend too much time on that, but everybody was great. I'd like to hear what we went through, how we felt, what surprised us, and then ultimately where we might go from this in the future, and what the tweaks for next time might be. Maybe Brendan will start us off by doing a rando's walkthrough of what actually happened.
Yeah, well, yeah. So yeah, dispensing with the wow, what a wonderful time, and thank you all so much. And that bit, yeah, it was a full weekend, but also incredibly fluid and just sort of organic. There was a rough kind of program I assembled for this, and actually relatively did a good job sticking close to the sorts of sequence of talks and whatnot, but also had a lot of wonderful room. And yeah, basically the way it was structured is people showed up kind of midday around Friday on the 13th, and we had some time to just sort of explore the property. Sky Meadow is 125 acres, so there's a lot to explore, but people just sort of slowly came in around 3-4 in the evening, and just took some time to take everything in, look at the ponds, even go for a dip. It was really nice. Some people came in, we all kind of gravitated towards one of the lower ponds, hung out there for a little bit. And of course, there's that initial sort of, hey, I know you in sort of two-dimensional form experience for a lot of people. And so it was really great to hug everyone and just sort of connect as people in 3 dimensions. So yeah, that was sort of the beginning, and then we all assembled for dinner at 6, and had just sort of a kind of a simple pizza dinner, but very sort of celebratory. Already, all the conversations were just exploding in every direction. That night, Layman was going to give a sort of talk on regenerative neo-shamanic spiritual traditions and these sorts of things, but everything was just sort of blooming that didn't really seem like making sense to sort of interrupt that. So we just kind of let that go, and people kept connecting. And that evening, we all assembled at the hilltop next to the meditation gazebo. There's a little fire pit up there, and hung out up there with a campfire. And that was sort of night 1. The frogs were going. It was this is my first spring here at Sky Meadow. I've been here in various other seasons, but this was first spring, and so the frogs were new to me as well. And that was sort of the backdrop orchestra to the first night, and actually I think kind of the whole weekend. But anyway, Saturday, the next day, was when everything really sort of came together, coalesced, and the series of talks got going. So I believe, Layman, you started out with talking about meditation and practices, states, and exploring that sort of a thing, different exercises. And then you and Bruce had your midday talk, or late morning, talking about integral post-metaphysical spirituality practices. Bruce, you led a great sort of exercise where people kind of went out and walked the property, and were sort of connecting with the prepositional realities of their kind of phenomenological selves, sort of repeating certain prepositions to ourselves, and really locating ourselves in the space and our relationship to relationship, which is really cool. I think a lot of people got a lot out of that. And so anyway, lunch, then Greg gave his talk on U-Talk, and kind of presenting the U-Talk framework of his as sort of the religion, a religion that's not a religion, and why and how that's the case, and long discussion there, which was really, really interesting. I also forgot to mention that on Saturday, a bunch of folks from the Monastic Academy came down, and Zach Stein as well was with them. And so all in all, we had a good number of folks here, and some visitors. So we were all there for that. And then there was just sort of a free time period where people got to hang out and keep the conversations going. I talked to Greg for a little bit with Zach and Brandon at a picnic table, getting into the weeds on U-Talk and the nature of consciousness. And so that sort of a thing, that was kind of typical of the whole weekend. I think a lot of people were having these sorts of experiences kind of all around the property. And then, that night talked about, Layman, you did a conversation with Scout on chakras, subtle energy, and that was recorded. And so I think that'll be coming out before long. And then dinner, and then more conversation with Greg between you, Layman, and he talking about Metamodern spiritual life, spiritual practice. And that to me was a really exciting event, just kind of happening right around the table after dinner. And there was just this electric energy in the air, this buzz and excitement. But I don't know, it was a really wonderful dynamic just watching you kind of field some of his questions and exploring a lot of this stuff. Really fascinating. And then similarly, we capped the evening with a bonfire up on the top of the hill. And then the next day, Sunday, was the closing day. And so talked a little bit in the morning about a number of things and sort of brought a lot of things together and considered where it was all going. If we were going, what actions, what concrete actions come out of this? What does the next time look like? Kind of reflect a little bit about the whole experience and just kind of bathed in the glow, the aura, the gladness, the enthusiasm, and the gratitude of that whole event. And so, slowly people then kind of departed around 1, and that was that. So that would be my kind of relatively quick summary of the weekend. But it was full and it was rich.
That's terrific. And what surprised you? What showed up that you didn't expect?
That you're in online community, I suppose, right? And you're not really sure how that translates to real life. And so there's a lot of uncertainty there about what could happen. It's sort of like a kind of the online dating sort of thing, right? You get a profile picture, maybe you have some great conversations, but then you meet in person and there's just no chemistry or something, or things just go terribly awry. And so not that I've ever had any experience like that, but so there's always that kind of uncertainty of how that's going to pan out. But I, in a beautiful way, I think I didn't know what the dynamic would be like, what the energy would feel like. And I was just so pleasantly surprised to find that everything just clicked and there was such enthusiasm and energy. So that's sort of a nice answer to that, I guess. I can think a little bit more about that, but I think overall I was just maybe one thing for me as sort of a host, I haven't really been in a logistical host-like capacity for an event like this. And so I was navigating that myself. And there were a lot of I never really thought that I would need to think about how to maybe do this at this moment and that sort of thing. So there were just sort of kind of personal elements of being in the role that I was in this space, kind of navigating those things. But a lot came up, and those are just a couple of things that rise to the surface at the moment.
Terrific. Thank you, Brendan. What about you, Bruce? What stands out for you from the event and also from reflecting about the event?
Yeah, I had a fantastic time. And just like Brendan said, sometimes you meet people and they're not what you expected. But in this case, it was just wonderful that everyone that we met that we had known from online, there was just an immediate sense of connection. And it's almost just almost not even like meeting them for the first time. It really just was a continued sense of intimacy with a little bit of new dimensions thrown in. But I came up here with Brandon Norgard. We came from California, and we had quite an ordeal actually making it to the retreat center with some missed flights and difficulty with the car. So it was a long, tiring journey there, but it was definitely worth it once we got there. The setting is idyllic. It's really beautiful. The architecture in the whole area is quaint and sometimes creepy. I thought we passed the chapel from Midnight Mass on the way to his retreat center, but I love spending the time in that retreat center. He's just got a magical piece of land and wonderful buildings, each with its own character. And I love spending the time with all the different critters there. The frogs, of course, that made the chorus throughout the whole weekend, and the alpacas and the sheep and the chickens and the ladybugs and lots of critters all around us. So it felt like we were in community in more than one way. So I really love that. One thing that stood out for me as a surprise was to be received by some people as an elder. And it's probably true. I'm probably the oldest person who was at the retreat, but the mind and the heart take some time to catch up with what's happening to your body. So I didn't feel like an elder there, but some people approached me that way, and I actually was touched by it. One thing that you and I talked about, Layman, was how remarkable it was to be at an event with so many brilliant, beautifully developed people, people who, many of whom could have been leading the retreat themselves. They have so much experience and knowledge and richness of their own that they did bring, as participants into the discussions and practices, but they also could have been leading. So it's not often that you can just step into a space of people that you've, not met before and have such a strong sense of resonance and shared depth. So that was really a treat. And Daniel showing up, and Zach and Tom Murray being there, and so many others, that, Brad Kirshner. It was really just a wonderful collection of people for me to be around and to dialogue with and to practice with. I'm glad the grammatology stuff that I led was well received. And that's prompted me, since I got some follow-up people after, both at the retreat and then writing to me afterwards, how do I learn about that? How do I do that more? It's kind of prompting me to maybe release some of that stuff earlier than planned, in terms of maybe some, putting together some of the practices I have as a little manual or something like that. So I'm thinking about that. The last thing I'll say, in terms of just overall impression and things that kind of delighted and surprised me. Yeah, of course, I really enjoyed our weekend evening out on Sunday with you and Brendan and Brandon, and well, there's one member. I'm kind of like not saying any name because I don't want to reveal anything that maybe they don't want revealed. But I was really touched by one person who was present at the event and really felt connected to what was going on and had been following integral and metamodern stuff for a long time, and had their own model and approach. But there was a kind of coming out that happened. They presented their work, and I think they were surprised to be received as well as they were by us. But to me, there's a kind of asking, am I actually welcome here? And there was a, resounding yes, of course, But it was a really touching moment to experience that, and to see and be with somebody who was finding themselves maybe, arriving home in a way. So I really was touched by that. So that's probably as much as I'd say an overview.
Yeah, that was, there were a couple interesting things on that last day, right? And that event was a really surprising, I think, an important part of the event that maybe a lot of the other people there didn't get to see because they'd already gone home by that point. I've also been thinking about the ambiguity of eldership the last couple of days. I should probably address these because when I came down from meditation and yoga on the last day, and I'd injured my foot because I'd never been doing a yogic handstand where I was that close to the ceiling fan before. So I've got a big bruise on my foot. But I came down, and one person was fully clad in amusing pajamas, and most everyone else had cat ears on. So after everyone left, there was still one pair of these. So the person who brought cat ears, and she knows who she is, and thank you also to her mother, the cat ears are still in play. What stands out to me in hindsight is how difficult it is to get all the balances just right? Like, is this too formal or not formal enough in how we're structuring it? Is there too much or not enough guided practice? Are there too many or not enough speakers? Am I leaning too far into the positive affects of spirit and growth and coherence and world changing, or too far into the negative affects of humor and morbidity and ambiguity and the profane? I'm not sure. There's so many balances. Generally, I think things went really well. I found the mood to be extremely nourishing. The people were brilliant. The ideas were apt. The space was extremely welcoming. But also, I can't help thinking about alternatives to how things went as a way of trying to set up in my mind what we could tweak for our next one. I have a couple of points of mild remorse from the trip, and I bring that up because I've been suggesting the importance of leaning into remorse-like valences, because I think that works really well with the integration surplus model. Some of my remorses are very trivial and personal, like I wish I'd done more to clean up. Wish I hadn't been so groggy at 3:30 in the morning at a Burlington hotel that I didn't spot the leaky coffee maker and save Brandon Norgard's wallet from getting wet. For some reason, that affects me emotionally. But others are more germane to how we organize all these things going forward. I feel like more time is needed next time, right? So that we can have more speakers, so that we can have more practice instruction and do that in a way that doesn't take away time from anything else. I wish there had been more opportunity to do work and connect with the land. I wish that I'd given, Bruce and some other people more space to talk because he's amazing. I realize I tried to praise the quiet people, but I don't know if I did that enough. I'm also aware that there are some thoughts around how to secure emerging tribal flavors with more structure. Like Daniela presents some issues around how male and female voices are held, right? And so are there specific genderized rituals that could be done in a way that would enrich the shared vibe without breaking it apart into identity concerns? And I've been thinking about how elders are treated in the space, because there's clearly an experience and age gap with people like Bruce and Tom Murray and Zach Stein and even Greg. It's not a huge gap. These people are only a few years older than me. And the very reason that they are viable elders is specifically because they're vital and deep and brilliant and still growing. But I think, why didn't I try out giving them special acknowledgement as elders in a way that might be natural to tribe formation? So that's something I'm sitting with. All that stuff's on my heart, but also I'm aware that everything that happened might be considered to be the expression of an intersubjective entity, right? So most of my decisions were responsive and improvisational, like I was working with something that was the meat of the event, right? And if we're, as some of us like to play with, syntheists, then how do we work with the emerging swarm entity of the Metamodern network event? Right? Is that a kind of a deity or spirit that we should be actively thinking about being in participation with as it comes to presence? And actually, I'm really curious how you two feel about that, about conceiving the mutually generative particular flavor as though it were a liminal agency of its own that might be suggesting to us how to bring it more into the world. How does that make you feel, Brandon?
I like that. Yeah, what you were saying brings up a lot, and maybe just to start with that thought, and then I can offer some of my own reflections maybe on differences or tweaks, that sort of a thing. I like being able to sort of name a kind of co-created entity, vibe, energy, both at risk of kind of reifying it into this thing, but then also with the wonderful opportunity to reify it or something like that, to make something of it. That in itself opens up all sorts of ideas in my head around ritualizing that, of sort of, a lot of my work also focuses on sort of personal myth making and interpersonal myth making, which I'm also starting to call transpersonal myth making. I think that might be a better term for it. But in that sense, right, how do we name those sort of tutelary spirits and deities and these things that we relate to in these collective spaces? I want to kind of draw that maybe into an intentional practice of artistically representing that. That could be a fascinating thing, but also always kind of holding those things loosely as well. I think that this community does that so wonderfully. There's a great seriousness and earnestness and depth to the kind of engagement with spiritual ideas, balanced with this lovely light-footedness, this sort of ease and a kind of dance-like grace, which I think is really inspiring. Whatever we call that, or however we relate to it, I think also building in a sort of a kind of also hyper-aware, deconstructive angle to that as well would be interesting. I think also that gets to other elements which I think could be more intentionally brought out, which is ritual more broadly. And this was something that was sort of discussed, was like, especially on the level of structure. And for the record, I mean, for my part anyway, I would say that the dance, the balance between structure and fluidity was, for me, just the right one. I think that there's something special about being very aware of the energy and dynamic of a room and not trying to impose upon that some kind of pre-established, well, we've got this program, so we've got to interrupt all of your fascinating conversations and deep heartfelt connection right now so that we can say a few words, because that's what's on the menu. So I actually appreciated the intention and the awareness, Layman, that you brought to how we kind of bring those things into spaces without sort of imposing them or stamping them. And I think that a lot of that worked out very well. But at the same time, I mean, it's sort of a blank slate. I guess I don't know if this would be a good opportunity to go on thoughts about, thinking about different ideas and tweaks, that sort of thing. Yeah. This was very much this is the first time that we're doing this, and we're not really sure exactly what this is going to look like. And going in, I actually expressed even explicitly sort of like, there's a lot that I expect to learn from this event as well. So I think that now that it's happened and we've done that, we have some kind of context to work with that's very helpful. And I think that ritual components would be a really interesting thing to bring in, even specifically ritual production or co-created ritual enactments. I'm not sure what that looks like, but something to kind of mark meaningful shifts and to help kind of create an appropriate sort of I'm going to use the word solemnity, but in more in its etymological sense, a sense of solemnness, the kind of like significance or even kind of muted profundity that comes with these sorts of transitions and that sort of thing. So anyway, that would be a thought of mine, and I would be interested to explore that and what that could look like. I also like the idea of something longer. I think that by the end of day 2, we were just all kind of really just in a kind of excited vibing space together, and it was sort of sad to then kind of let that go the next day. So the idea of maybe starting this on a Thursday and ending on a Sunday would be interesting. And then there's a lot of thoughts to this that probably aren't particularly interesting or compelling to a wider audience, but just the logistical elements on my end and thinking about stuff. How do I properly relate myself as sort of the host and the kind of person figuring out a lot of the logistical factors here to the realities, not overextending myself, not underappreciating my own sort of contribution to this, whether that's financially or whatever, trying to find a good relationship that seems to work where everyone kind of, feels like everything's in balance in a way for them that works. So there's a lot of stuff to kind of work out there. I mean, if you extend a retreat for another day, that affects pricing, it affects travel, transport, logistics, and all that sort of stuff. And I don't usually tend to think of myself as sort of wearing that hat, but in this case, I am. So yeah, those are some thoughts to me, and I have others as well, but yeah.
Bruce, how do you feel about the vibe as entity lens, as well as anything else that you wanted to bring into this? So particularly, I would think things that you would like to see more of or like to see less of.
I was surprised by how a coherent kind of, at least from my own felt experience, the coherent mood seemed to pervade the whole event. And there was just a shared kind of excitement and intimacy and depth and respect. And there were no conflicts that I saw coming up. And so maybe that is a warning sign that this was just our little honeymoon period. And we've got to do a few more retreats before a little bit of that kind of tension surfaces. That's usually how it goes. But there was already a very strong sense of a collective spirit that was emerging among us. And even from people from very different kinds of backgrounds, but still with somehow a similar sensibility. So I felt that there was a number of people kept using the word that about presencing. I'd like to presence this, I'd like to presence that. And I felt like collectively there was a presencing happening in between us. That was just nice to just sit in and be part of. There were moments around the fire or sitting on the porch where I could hear the little sounds off somewhere, somebody playing a flute, some people laughing and talking up on the patio. And just that whole atmosphere was reverberating and lovely. And it did seem to have its own momentum. I did think about what would happen if we extended it out for a longer period. A lot of people are working and other kinds of obligations. It's harder to do that. But in my past, most of the retreats I've done have been longer. And there's more that can organically unfold. There's more space in between. When you think you've only got like really one full day, there's for me on my side, I felt there's a kind of time pressure that, we've got to get this covered within this little space of time. But if it's a longer period, you can kind of let the whole thing breathe a little bit more. So, yeah, I definitely would like to see you and us experiment with length. I did think both, Brendan and you, Layman, did a wonderful job overall holding the container. Just, yeah, Brendan, I didn't notice anything standing out as really for your first time. I mean, it was great. Nothing standing out as like, oh, this was obviously forgotten, or nothing like that. It all really unfolded pretty smoothly and comfortably. And Layman was very sensitive to the energy and the dynamics of the group. So I think you both did a beautiful job with that. I would like to see maybe some more ritual and practice participatory kind of elements. I was thinking about setting the container with maybe an opening ritual to, set up the mandala, and then a closing ritual to dissolve the mandala, and then maybe some transitional things. There were people already spontaneously doing some things like that, relating to the land and doing some magical and other kinds of practices to really set a container. And so that could have been harnessed and turned into more of a group thing. And, in the longer retreats that I've been part of, typically logistically, we had, volunteer schedules where people who are there will have an hour or two out of the retreat, or maybe, 30 minutes a day, where they step in and they help with a cleaning task or a straightening task or a room setup task or something like that. So it's not all on one person's shoulders, and there's more of a sense that we're co-creating this space together. And if there's a longer event, some of the long Dzogchen retreats I used to do 7 days long or 10 days long, I volunteered as a cook in the kitchen for those events. And so there could be work study kind of situations set up for, especially, short weekends, you don't really probably need that, but anything longer, it would make sense to have that as an option. Maybe some of the younger participants who don't have as much money maybe to bring in, they could come in a work study capacity and help out in that way. That's how I met my wife. I mean, that's a magical stuff can happen in the kitchens and retreats. So I think everybody should have that opportunity.
I want to question you a little bit more about the eldership thing, Bruce, because, when we were out at American Flatbread in Burlington, which was lovely, there was a bit of discussion about Wilbur and Wilbur's death and sort of what when that generation is gone, then the next generation, regardless of how they feel and what their age is, they're the elders, right? So that includes you. And how do I think about honoring that in a way that is not dismissive? Because there's a danger in thinking of the elders and well, kind of putting them out to pasture kind of thing, which is not what we want to do. And like I was saying, we're only 10 years apart in age. This is not a big gap.
Yeah.
But as either an elder or the elder of the next 5 to 10 years, how do you feel that we could go about honoring you and some of the other older, more experienced people in a way that is satisfying to you?
There is a feeling of awkwardness that I encounter just of people approaching me that way, because I'm not used to thinking of myself that way. But it also was touching, and I was like, okay, you've got to learn to own this and sit in that, because it is happening, like it or not. But I think possibly one thing that could be done is, making some kind of space for, a dialogical kind of setting, where maybe there could be some kind of, recollective sharing. Somebody could presence memory for the community around something. One member there was bringing a number of books that his father had written, and who would have been an elder in this community, who was already thinking about many of the themes that were informing our retreat, decades ago, right? And with connections to Buckminster Fuller and all of that. So there is, I think, something that people who have been in this longer and who maybe can, for instance, I think there's a sense sometimes, me talking with some elderly people, we kind of joke behind the scenes that in some ways it seems like some of the metamodern people think that they're inventing all this, and this has been happening again and again, right? And I would say what I experienced happening in the retreat, yes, there have been events and movements and efforts like this, repeated many times, and I've been part of some of those things. But I would say the kind of the quality of the people that were present in this group, and the sophistication of their grasp of the perspectives and the was different than it was 20, 30 years ago. I felt like a gradual cultural maturing, right? So that, at least that's my experience compared to the relative to the groups I've been in. So it's not like this group is just doing the same thing over again. There's something new here. There's a depth, there's an increased sophistication of perspective, so there's been like a marination in this stuff that's happened in the culture over time, right? That I think is showing its fruits in something like this. And Brad and I were talking about how often Ken Wilber's name came up. And even though this wasn't a integral event, nevertheless, his impact and imprint on many were very clearly presenced. And so I think that thing, there could be made some space to kind of like recognize and honor that kind of thing. And maybe if there are elders present, if it can be just some kind of dialogical event where there's maybe some encouraging of presencing community memory for everybody. How has this been done before? What can we learn here? What's the new edge that you perceive? That kind of thing.
That's really nice. I appreciate that. And I want to say as well that I think both of you have kind of said it in different ways. I was really impressed and even a little surprised by the sheer reliability of everyone. I just thought, as moral human beings, as multidimensional creatures, as vision logic thinkers, as spiritual practitioners, there was just such an extraordinary caliber of people. So it would be a shame not to try to do something with so many good tools, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to presence a few anomalous factors that stood out for me. I think, the memes in a way, Stishan's t-shirts, I couldn't get enough of them. He kept changing them to show them all off. They were all fantastic. A couple of phrases came out of this. I was joking that maybe equivocation is too strong a word. Is the perfect Graham Dempsey t-shirt because he's so beautifully careful and nuanced with the way he tries to think through things. Brendan and I were driving to Burlington with John DeGrief, and John inadvertently said testosterone, like tautological. So we were joking about a tautological chemical. That's still in my mind. And when I said goodbye to Brandon Norgard, I said, may you build the hold-ons of heaven, based on this conversation I'd had with him around the possibility of hold-ons individually and collectively going on to some other realm to do the real work we think we're trying to do here, which is a beautiful way of thinking about it. I felt like the pond was a real center for me. I did a lot of swimming, had a lot of nice private conversations down there, saw a lot of frogs mating close up, had to wash a lot of fish slime off me. What a beautiful little space down there. And I saw a bear. Apparently it was just me, but it was a really beautiful 2 minutes of seeing this thing amble through the space that we later all inhabited. I love that. I was interested in thinking about next time looking at the kinds of discussions that people were spontaneously having. Seemed like there was a lot of wanting to share around our own spiritual autobiographies and projects we're working on. Seemed like a lot of interest in further discussion around what is the subtle and who's seen what and how do we hold that. And a lot of discussion around the cultural aspect of metamodernity. Right? What are the movies? What are the music? What is the art? How do we gauge that? And is there any way that can be a theme that we come together around without sacrificing the philosophical and spiritual elements? So I guess I would just open it up to both of you, maybe starting with Brendan. Any kind of, random anomalous things that are still on your mind from the event?
Let me let that, as both of you have been talking, a lot's come up for me too. So let me see if I can go back to that in a moment. But I just wanted to popcorn respond to some of these things. One was, Bruce, you talked about presencing, and I like the idea of a presence maybe as a term that gets to that element that Layman was getting at. As someone, maybe it's a little ironic as someone who's very interested in the reconstructive act of new mythos and mythopoeia and these sorts of things. I'm like, well, do we want to call this a deity? And maybe that's my overly cautious element coming out as well. But I like the idea of sort of at least naming that as a presence, that there's something that's that the presencing going on by this collective group creates a presence. Which has a lovely sort of, semantic slippage into it. More like that kind of sense of Geist, there. And so anyway, that was just something that came up, and thinking in that vein might be productive for me. One thing too, to something you were getting at, Layman, was just now talking about swimming and the frogs and the fish and all this. I've grown up in Vermont my whole life. I've grown up, I've lived in Vermont for most of my life. I grew up in Vermont, I guess is what I mean to say. And so part of the uncertainty element is like, how rustic are people going to find this environment? It's not sort of a boutique spa by any means, but I think it's also a very comfortable space too. And so I think different people have different sorts of relationships to that. And I'm kind of curious about how this space lands for people in that regard. But at the same time, I also appreciate a lot about the kind of back to nature vibe here, which is really important for me and for my spiritual practice, and would love to sort of weave that element in more intentionally and explicitly in certain ways. But that was another thing that came up. More germane though, more important, I think, around the vibe, the essence, the spirit, the presence, and what Bruce was getting at in terms of a kind of cultural maturation. I was glad that, and I was afraid that this wouldn't be the case, and I wasn't sure what this would look like, but I was glad that the vibe that was produced and the activities that were engaged in lacked a certain taste or feeling that I've known in many kind of spiritual communal spaces, which is one that I find kind of uncomfortable and awkward. I mean, there are many different kinds of sort of, negative valence spiritual moods, and I think sort of I wasn't expecting in any way sort of a fundamentalist vibe to show up here. But what I have sometimes seen in other spaces is this more kind of new agey, wooey, kind of cringy thing that happens where, especially in ritual practice, right, that we're going to do communally, it's like, all right, let's all sit down, and then comes some kind of strange thing that we're supposed to do, which, depending on your temperament, is going to make you feel like an idiot, but you have to do it, kind of like there's this peer pressure vibe, and then you're kind of trying to like not stand out, and you just feel so self-conscious and awkward about everything, and somehow this is supposed to make everyone feel good and maybe deeper spiritual. Anyway, I'm not sure if that lands, if what I'm saying kind of, people are like, yes, I know what that's like. For me, I really don't like that. And there was a beautiful way in which not just the vibe, but also the practices that we did over the weekend didn't have any of that. It was, there was just a great comfortability. And I felt like that was lovely to allow for different temperaments to inhabit the space. Not everyone is an extrovert. Some people think it's just the most spiritual, wonderful thing all the time to go around the circle and talk about what we're feeling, what's coming up. Some people hate that, but that never gets presenced, right? It's always like you're just expected to have to share, or to have to do this or have to do that. And I think that there's probably something about a more kind of mature, developed, multi-perspectival appreciation of difference that I think informs some of that greater sensitivity there. It's just kind of a notion. Another thing that came up for me too is this idea around eldership. There's also an apprenticeship kind of question, I think, in the mix as well, right? There's sort of the flip side of that coin is, what does it mean to be in sort of the starting out generation, and you're looking up to people, and you're taking insight from people that you respect and care about. How does one inhabit that role in a kind of full, enriched sort of way? And how do we keep those relationships of that right dynamic, right? Because when there are those sort of teacherly authority dynamics, in the past, maybe that's, elder and apprentice, but in this context, what is that? It's different. I think one of the things that worked actually really well about the whole space was that even though there was a kind of teacherly authority asymmetrical component to some of this, there was also just a deep friendship, a kind of peer friendship that grounded it all. So that, while I can appreciate that there's, a lot of things that I'm learning and growing from by some of these instructions and these talks and the guidance and all that, it's not framed in a way that's kind of, it doesn't foreground the hierarchical component of here's something I'm giving to you. It's much more peer-to-peer and rooted in kind of strong and robust interpersonal positive dynamics. And so I think that goes a long way to doing that. But then also I wanted to throw in the idea that, and this is down the road, tweaks, changes, new opportunities, ideas, which you kind of named, I think, Layman, which is like, yeah, what if we had some opportunities where other people could express themselves, could share their stories in a way that, has a nice container to it. So it's not just sort of, here's the mic, go for, however long, but it's something like a more intentional space where some of that asymmetry can kind of break down a little bit. And there can be more of a, let's open it up. Let's have intentional spaces where kind of participants are sort of sitting down on the couch and saying, here's what I went through, and that sort of a thing. So those were some things that came up. And then I guess, yeah, in terms of the anomalous, I mean, there were so many wonderful components, times with you, Layman, you showed up a bit early to kind of get things ready. And so having some time to just talk with you and just sort of hang out in context. I think that was sort of, this was a dynamic that really struck me about the whole weekend, was that when you bond with people based largely on sort of deep, ideas that are very kind of heady, intellectual, but also spiritual, obviously, kind of ideas, then most of your interactions with someone are sort of like idea forward. And then usually friendships kind of develop the other way, right? It's like you hang out with people, you appreciate their vibe, you have fun, and then maybe you can have these conversations. But a lot of this context in this community, it begins the other way. So just being able to kind of hang out and kind of, I don't know, talk about Star Wars or, things like that, totally kind of unrelated, but more just sort of like filling in the blanks of those kinds of friend, dynamics that don't really make sense necessarily to come out and say like the Metamodern Spirituality Facebook group context or these sorts of, spaces, but just in person kind of, off the cuff sort of things. But so that was really special. I mean, things will, pop up in my head too, of little things here and there that maybe I'll share by the end. But anyway, those were just some thoughts.
Sure, terrific. What about you, Bruce? Any other thinking toward next time thoughts or anomalous features of this one that are still in your mind that you'd like to share?
There is a block of cheese which is just hovering with an aura of sublime beauty in my mind right now. There was this cheese that was served there that was just really good, and somehow there was almost a spiritual experience of just like savoring that really nice taste in an unexpected way. I actually didn't hardly eat on the way. I didn't hardly eat there, which is probably a good thing for me. I've been wanting to lose my COVID weight. But there was those few moments when I did eat, the food just was really vibrant and I really felt connected to it. And that cheese was like a little communion element for me right there, right at the right time. I think going forward, there's part of me that feels a little cautious about getting too deliberate about what happens next time. I think some deliberation in what we're doing is important, but there was something that we allowed to emerge between us, and I don't want to like over rigidify a set of expectations or a container. I think just playing organically with some things, like with space, like maybe how we might shift around to different spaces, or with time, adding a little bit more time, or things like that could allow for some new things to happen. I do think ritual and practice a little bit more would be nice, just to ground it, some work orientation. But I did appreciate and the opportunities for there to be kind of organically arising structure, like when we were sitting around the fire circle one night, and somebody suggested, let's do a circle sharing around something, and then that kind of just happened in its own way, but it grew out of our presence together. And so I think if we can be careful to just craft a generative enclosure that allows for those kinds of points of emergence, that's really nice. But there was somebody who shouted at one point when we were talking about, well, are we going to meet and do a talk or not? And somebody said, I want my money's worth. Of course, let's go meet and talk. So, there is this expectation that people are coming to receive certain things. So I think we don't want to get too loose and lose what we've promised to offer. I think it's a dance of finding the right balance. But for the most part, for what happened in this occasion, I think the balance was just right. And I left feeling really, really touched and really satisfied, and really nourished from the encounter.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting ideas about how we can do it next time, but we've got to be careful to make sure we preserve what was so great about this time. My sense of the spirit of everyone, and actually my own inner life, feels like it's shifted half an inch since the event, and that's still with me. Getting those balances right, having enough structure. I would love to have had more time to talk and more time to have guided practices and things like that. So it's clear that we would need a little bit longer period of time to get all that done. I think opening and closing rituals is important. The stuff around eldership and dialogue and apprenticeship, that's really interesting. I think it's important to have people come in different waves and go out in different waves too, because that gives you different mixtures. I think it would be interesting to have some times where there were 2 or 3 talks or events or practices happening simultaneously, so people could break up into subclusters, and also more people could have a chance that way to try on the role of the guide or the framer. I mean, I loved how loose and organic it was. I definitely want to preserve that. I think we did a really good job of recovering from, like Brendan was saying, this, you go to some kinds of retreats and there's these hidden implicit imperatives or ways you're supposed to behave. Just like there's always some kind of subconscious or subliminal sense of, well, who's talking and who gets to be up front, and there's all these little social things that go on. And I think we recovered from them a lot, right? Like there were points where some people were almost too much of an authority at the front of the room, or some people were almost felt like they were a little bit off-sided, and we were able to come back from that in a really smooth, enriching way. So whatever entity or whatever we want to call it did that, I want to nourish and keep that alive and feed it with the kinds of balances that we did really correctly. I would love to do another one where there was the opportunity to come a little bit earlier, right? And not everyone had to take that up, that some people could come for a week and some people could come for 2 days. Do that a little bit differently. I would really love to, like I said there, have more chances for people to do volunteer work with the land, and have that be the practice, right? Maybe meet in the morning and do a framing, but have actually working be the practice, and to contribute to the space as well, because it's such a huge participant. And John had suggested that some of, or maybe all of the talks could actually be anti-talks, in the sense of the speaker questions the people rather than telling them things. And right, so that fits with my skill set fairly well, but that would also be a good way to elicit from everyone, because we're, like we've been saying here, such smart, deep, rich, reliable, interesting people. Be a shame not to hear from all of them as much as we could. So there might be a way to twist the speaker and group format into its opposite. That would be interesting to me.
Yeah, someone had an interesting idea which relates to all of this, which is, well, this was a spring retreat, and then I thought, well, do we want to wait another year and do another spring retreat, or do we want to do something in the fall? And then I forget who, I think it might have been Station, suggested, planting and harvest, and what a beautiful thing that could work into be, in terms of a, working the land element, but also ritualistic, also container. Just there's a lovely symmetry there about that. So I was really interested in something like that. I also wanted to presence the fact that some of the most sort of quintessentially spiritual, to my taste, moments were interacting with people in work spaces, particularly when I was in the kitchen. And I think there was, one, and this also when Aaron was cooking, people would show up at the door, be like, "Can I help? Can I do anything?" There was just such a kind of such a generosity and an eagerness and interest to help when I was cleaning up in the kitchen after dinner, and it was Ellen from the Monastic Academy and a few others. Tom Murray was doing all the dishes, and there was just this feeling of incredible connection in those sorts of vibes. I'm sure there's an element of that coming from my kind of Christian upbringing. When in high school, I wasn't Catholic, but I went to a Catholic school, and I would go to these Catholic retreats, and I would often have the most powerful experiences in the cleaning up contexts, because this is where I'm interacting with someone who is just trying to serve. There was a spirit of service coming very powerfully from lots of people, and so that really resonated. And I like the idea of bringing that to more of this event. It's hard for me personally. I'm the sort of temperament, personality type, or what have you, that especially if I'm in a host capacity, I'm trying to make everything easy for everyone and don't want to impose. So there's a strong sense of just, what can I do to just kind of clear the path for everyone? And yet I feel like that also then, doesn't allow people to do those sorts of things. At the same time, this also plays into other broader issues, which are both logistic, but have deeper implications. The big one for me is price. I want people to be able to participate in this. I don't want anyone to be priced out of this sort of event. At the same time, it's sort of like, well, these things do cost money, and it costs money to upkeep a retreat center. And there's also something about, how do we relate, the price of something and its value? There's all sorts of cultural ways that these things get intertwined. I mean, I think someone, I forget who it was, remarked to me like, why was this so cheap? And I was like, oh, that's great to hear. I'm glad, but there's a lot of variability there. And I'd like to find ideally ways of doing this, especially if it expands to longer. It was underpriced for this, especially with inflation and all these other things, right? So like these things will have to be negotiated in the future, but I want this to be something that isn't just this sort of, dropping lots of money to go have these experiences, because there's something anathema in my sensibility about, partaking in meaningful religious community and then having to do that in a way that's prohibitively expensive or something like that. Right. So that's a big thing for me too. But one more thing I wanted to say as well is that, one more thing I wanted to say was that I'm an introvert. And yet, having been around all these people over the weekend, normally that would I would crash at the end of that, and I'd need a whole week to just recover. But this was not like that at all. I was just the next day feeling very, and the energy of this group it wasn't like, it didn't take, it was giving. And so I there wasn't something I needed to recover from being, in this sort of social space for so long. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because that's relatively rare for me, but it really spoke to just the quality of the connections of the whole time. So yeah, those are some other things I wanted to
Yeah, that's really, I think, underappreciated, the toll that just socializing can take on sensitive people. We had the Ontario Depth Adaptation meeting on the STOA last night, and that's part of that question is sort of, in an apocalypse, who would you actually be willing to have in your bunker, so to speak, right? Like what survival partners would not be exhausting to you? And this was really enlivening. It didn't cost the introvert in me anything either. It paid the introvert in me as well. I love everything you said there, Brendan, and we'll work on logistics, and we'll feel out whether there's an appetite to have this be spring, fall, or just annual, or whatever it is. I'm, as of now, open to however we all want to do it, whatever the appetite is. I guess we're at about an hour now, so we're going to wrap it up. I had a beautiful time, and I'm still having that beautiful time to some degree, and I look forward to being able to participate in and share more with these people and with this space. Any last thoughts, Bruce?
I think I just share all of that. There were 2 points that I would rather add in than leave out of the talk. So they're just randomly pulling in. But just one, it was great to connect with Greg. And I think all of us had a time at different times to meet and talk in depth outside of the events. And so, I had one evening where I could, hang out with Greg a little bit in his room and talk. And that was really lovely. And I kind of missed being able to do that with you and Brendan. We just were all too busy organizing our stuff. But we did have the nice evening out, so I was appreciative of that on Sunday. I really enjoyed that time with you. There was a deja vu moment after we did our talk on post-metaphysical spirituality, where Zach came up to me afterwards and said, how can you talk about post-metaphysics without talking about Habermas and Peirce, And he did that exactly like 5 years ago at an introductory conference. And then too, I had talked about post-metaphysics without mentioning Habermas and Peirce. So it's it's definitely my fault twice, and they definitely have featured in our thinking and our writing, but for whatever reason, they don't get presenced in such talks. But I'm glad for him to bring that. And yes, let's all pay respects to Habermas and Peirce for sure. But yeah, respects to you guys too. I really, really love being with you in this event.
Yeah, thanks so much. They're just such a, whatever went on there was something like love.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.